America is supposed to be the democratic standard by which the whole earth actually judges and actually looks at when they talk about democracy. But the debt our democracy refuses to pay, we call this nation a representative democracy. We say its government derives its power from the people, but history and truth reveal something else. When it came to black people, America's representatives colluded not to uplift, but to oppress, not to pay what was justly owed, but to deny, to delay, and to disappear justice itself. From the beginning, this democracy chose white supremacy over true representation. The Constitution counted the enslaved as 3/5 of a person, not to grant them rights, but to inflate the power of slave states in Congress. Slaveholders who wrote the laws, judged the cases, and shaped the institutions that would protect their wealth built on stolen labor. And when slavery finally ended, did this democracy do its duty to those who had built roads, cleared fields, and filled its coffers? No. Instead, it paid reparations to the enslavers in Washington, D.C., compensating them for the loss of their so-called property, while the freed men and women received nothing. The betrayal continued. After promising 40 acres and a mule, the federal government handed that land back to the Confederates who had raised arms against the nation. Freed people were left to start life with empty hands on hostile soil. And while the Constitution was amended to promise equal protection and the right to vote, this democracy, through Congress, state houses, courts, local governments, colluded to block black progress at every turn. Black codes criminalized black freedom. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and humiliation. The Freedmen's Bank collapsed under mismanagement, wiping out black savings. So who do you think was managing black savings? Federal housing policy drew red lines around black neighborhoods, starving them of loans and investment. The GI Bill was weaponized to lift white veterans into home ownership and college while shutting black veterans out. And today, voter suppression laws surgically target black communities, providing that collusion never ended. And it just evolved, like so many of other things, like plantations, corporations, education and colleges. This was not a democracy operating imperfectly. It was a democracy deliberately and repeatedly choosing white supremacy over justice. It was a democracy failing to do its most basic duty, to represent the people equally, protect their rights, and ensure each person received their just due. Some argue these betrayals belong to the past, but the consequences live with us now. The racial wealth gap, where the medium black family has a fraction of the wealth of the medium white family. Underfunded black schools, black neighborhoods, over-policed and unprotected. Black voters targeted by modern poll taxes and gerrymandering. And every time reparations are raised, this democracy turns away. Congress finds time to subsidize corporations, to pass trillion-dollar tax cuts for the wealthy, to fund wars on foreign soil. But when the question is whether black Americans should be repaid for centuries of stolen labor and stolen life. Suddenly, there is no money, no time, no will. Why? Because underneath it all lies a truth this democracy refuses to confess. It does not want to pay black people what is owed, not because it cannot, but because to do so would force the nation to admit its wealth, its very foundation, is stained by centuries of collusion and hatred and bloodshed. A true democracy would face this history, not hide from it. It would listen to descendants of the enslaved, not silence them. It will repair, not deny. But ours has not. And until it does, it remains democracy in name only. A system built to serve the few at the expense of the many and to protect the stolen wealth rather than repay it. So let us speak plainly. A democracy cannot bring itself to pay what it owes to those built. It is a democracy that has failed. And until America finds the courage to do so, justice by black people, the promise of democracy will remain unfinished. A promise betrayed by collusion, by hatred, and the stubborn survival of white supremacy. Just due denied how laws and institutions cemented racial wealth gaps in America. The promise of just due, that people are entitled to the fruits of their labor and the protection of law, was a promise made only to some. When slavery formally ended, the country's legal and economic systems ensured that enslavers were compensated for their losses, while those who unpaid labor built American prosperity received nothing. This injustice was not accidental. It was enforced and sustained through a network of laws, policies, and institutions designed to privilege white Americans of European descent and to systematically block black economic mobility. Compensation for slave owners, nothing for the enslaved. One stark example, after the British abolished slavery in the 1830s, that they paid $20 million in compensation, not to the freed, but to the enslavers. In the U.S., the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, and the 13th Amendment ended legal slavery. Who said so? There were similar efforts to compensate slave owners and holders. The most direct, the District of Columbia Emancipation Act of 1862, which paid slave owners up to $300 per freed person, a substantial sum at the time, while granting the freed individuals nothing, therefore re-enslaving them because they had nowhere to go, they had nothing to eat, they had no place they could go and make a living for themselves. This policy made it clear whose property rights were protected and whose humanity was disregarded. Post-Civil War betrayals. After emancipation, there were brief attempts to deliver just due to free people. The most famous was Special Field Order Number 15, 1865, which promised formerly enslaved families 40 acres and a mule on confiscated Confederate land. But this promise was quickly reversed by President Andrew Johnson, who restored land to former Confederates, once again prioritizing the wealth of those who had enslaved others. Now, institutionalizing inequality. Through Reconstruction and beyond laws, institutions continue to block black advancement. The Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, the Freedmen's Bank, all these were collapsed, corrupted, mismanaged, or outright lied. Okay? Now, one of the things that we want to talk about before we close is that this was not something that people don't know about right now and today. Okay? Generations of compounded advantage and exclusion created a barricade against black upward mobility that still stands, and yet we do nothing.